There's something massive happening beneath the waves of the Pacific Ocean right now, a shift spanning thousands of kilometers, and it has been playing a dangerous game of hide-and-seek with scientists for months. Now, out there for all the world to witness, the Pacific Ocean is undergoing what can only be described as a violent flip. The latest information suggests we are standing right on the precipice of a so-called Super El Niño, possibly the strongest El Niño event in 140 years. We're talking about a very rare, high-intensity episode that would propel global temperatures into completely uncharted territory. This isn't just some seasonal shift you can shrug off. It's a global reorganization of energy, like the planet is rewiring its own thermostat. According to the newest data available, there is now a 98% chance of El Niño emerging by August. And by September of 2026, the rise of a full-blown Super El Niño is now looking almost inevitable. This kind of El Niño would bring intensified heat waves, floods, droughts, and dramatic shifts in monsoon and hurricane patterns all around the globe. So the real question worth asking is this: could a 2026 Super El Niño push our climate past the point of no return? Let's dig into the mechanics of this climate engine together, because honestly, I didn't expect to be putting this story together quite this quickly. Let me rewind the clock a bit, back to a discussion a few months ago about the weak La Niña we experienced in 2025, one that carried over into 2026. That La Niña was so weak, in fact, that we floated the idea of a Pacific flip being possible, a kind of climate whiplash where after months of La Niña's cold pattern, the Pacific would essentially be coiled like a spring, primed to swing hot and unleash a monster of an El Niño. Back when that idea was first raised, the odds of it actually happening were pretty low, and nobody really knew how hot things could get, if they got hot at all. But as it turns out, that prediction was spot on, and it is unfolding right in front of our eyes, unfortunately, with things escalating faster than expected. So let's do a quick recap for anyone who needs the refresher. The El Niño Southern Oscillation, often just called ENSO, describes a natural cycle of variations in the Pacific Ocean's surface temperatures and air pressure near the equator. Think of it like a giant pendulum swinging back and forth across the ocean. Normally, trade winds push warm surface water away from South America, from the eastern Pacific, over toward Asia. As that warm water travels westward, cold water rises up from the depths to take its place, in a process oceanographers call upwelling. When everything is balanced like this, we call it ENSO neutral, basically the ocean's resting heartbeat. Now, if those trade winds weaken, that upwelling effect gets suppressed, and a warm patch builds up in the eastern Pacific. If sea surface temperatures there climb more than half a degree Celsius above the long-term average, that's officially an El Niño. On the flip side, when trade winds strengthen, ocean temperatures actually dip below average, giving us a La Niña, where temperatures drop more than half a degree Celsius below normal. This whole cycle typically lasts somewhere between 9 and 12 months, and it repeats roughly every 2 to 7 years. As of now, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, we are technically sitting in an ENSO neutral state, but that is not going to last much longer. During a typical El Niño, sea surface temperatures in the eastern Pacific usually climb somewhere between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius above normal, and this shift ends up rearranging tropical convection currents and jet streams like furniture being dragged across a room. This typically brings wetter winters to California and parts of South America, while drying out Australia, Indonesia, and southern Africa. Here's a genuinely strange quirk about El Niño: it tends to suppress Atlantic hurricanes. What happens is that it ramps up upper-level winds across the tropical Atlantic, creating wind shear that literally rips apart tropical storm systems before they have a chance to organize into hurricanes. Unfortunately, that's not good news everywhere else, because that same energy boost supercharges the potential for Pacific storms instead. That's because warm surface water acts like rocket fuel for tropical storms, allowing them to spin up into full-blown cyclones. El Niño also tends to nudge global average temperatures up by roughly 0.1 to 0.2 degrees Celsius above the existing trend, which often means these years end up shattering global temperature records, especially when they overlap with the planet's already ongoing warming trend. Now, I want to be clear here, this isn't some brand new phenomenon, and El Niño itself is not a byproduct of climate change. It's a completely natural part of how our planet breathes, a heartbeat that has been thumping along for at least 10,000 years. We actually have chemical fingerprints of ENSO preserved in ancient coral fossils and sediment cores, stretching back long before anyone ever built the first steam engine. But this particular year feels different. Something unusual is brewing out there in the Pacific, and it's starting to look very much like we're heading straight for what people are calling a Super El Niño. Let's do a little housekeeping on what actually counts as a Super El Niño, because if you ask the scientists directly, that term technically doesn't even exist in the official literature. It just happens to make for a great headline and, admittedly, a great thumbnail. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the agency right on the front lines of monitoring this stuff, tracks El Niño using something called the Oceanic Niño Index. It's essentially a 3-month running average of sea surface temperature measured against a 30-year baseline. As mentioned earlier, an El Niño is officially declared when that index climbs above 0.5 degrees Celsius for 5 or more overlapping 3-month seasons in a row. And just to make things a little more complicated, the agency recently updated how it measures El Niño altogether. It's now called the Relative Oceanic Niño Index, and it accounts for the extra background warming from climate change, something the older methods simply didn't factor in. Under this new measuring system, a weak El Niño falls between 0.5 and 1 degree Celsius. A moderate one sits between 1.0 and 1.5 degrees Celsius, and a strong El Niño ranges from 1.5 up to 2 degrees Celsius. So with a little creative liberty, we could say a Super El Niño would be anything sitting at 2 degrees Celsius above average or higher. And even though there's no official term for it, this kind of event has absolutely happened before. In fact, it's happened 4 separate times since the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration began keeping these records, in 1982, 1991, 1997, and most recently in 2015. In every single one of those cases, the relative index rating came in above 2 degrees Celsius. And in November of 2015 specifically, the index hit a staggering 2.4 degrees Celsius, well beyond what you'd even call strong. Honestly, that reading was basically ready to duck into a phone booth, swap its glasses for a cape, and fly off as a superhero. But in all seriousness, these massive events carry consequences that ripple across the entire globe. The 2015 El Niño lined up with a severe drought in Ethiopia, water shortages hitting Puerto Rico, and an extraordinary Central Pacific hurricane season, all combining together to push global temperatures to record-breaking highs. More than 60 million people were affected worldwide, with extreme food insecurity striking hardest across Africa, Central America, and Pacific Island nations. That same event also triggered the most devastating global coral bleaching episode ever recorded, essentially a mass die-off event for reef ecosystems around the planet. And the damage wasn't just environmental. An estimated $3.9 trillion was wiped from the global economy over the following 3 years, driven by lost agricultural productivity and widespread infrastructure damage. So let's pause right there for a moment, because I know everything we've just covered can feel like a lot to take in, and it might even leave you feeling a bit powerless in the face of it all. Let's get back to this idea of a Super El Niño, because the story here is genuinely wild, and yes, history really might be about to repeat itself. As of early 2026, the tropical Pacific slipped back into what's called an El Niño Southern Oscillation neutral state, right after that weak La Niña we talked about earlier. On paper, that sounds calm, almost boring, but don't let that fool you, because that's only what's happening on the surface. It's what's brewing underneath the water that's starting to set off alarm bells for climate scientists. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the agency that keeps constant tabs on ocean conditions, reports that the ocean's subsurface heat content has been steadily climbing for months now, and it's sitting well above what's considered normal. Between March and April of 2026, meteorologists actually observed bursts of westerly winds pushing warm water eastward across the Pacific. That right there is a textbook warning sign, a classic precursor to El Niño forming. Here's why that matters. Normally, the Pacific trade winds blow from east to west, which keeps all that warm water piled up in the western Pacific, sort of trapped there like water behind a dam. But those winds are faltering right now. As they weaken, something remarkable happens. A series of Kelvin waves, these are massive underwater pulses of warm water, start traveling thousands of miles across the ocean, moving from west to east. When they finally slam into the South American coastline, they essentially uncork all that stored up heat. Suddenly you've got this enormous reservoir of thermal energy just sitting there, ready to be unleashed into the atmosphere. And we're not just guessing this is happening. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration actually caught one of these Kelvin waves red-handed using the Sentinel-6 Michael Freilich satellite. You can literally watch, in the satellite imagery, this wave of warm water crossing the entire Pacific Ocean and crashing into the South American coast. It's one thing to model this stuff theoretically, it's another thing entirely to watch it happen in near real time from space. But here's the real catch, the part that should give us pause. This isn't just a natural cycle playing out in isolation. This time, we're layering a natural surge of heat onto a planet that has already spent 12 consecutive months above the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold. 2024, remember, was the hottest year ever recorded, and it happened during an El Niño Southern Oscillation neutral year, meaning there was no extra heating boost from El Niño at all. So, before we even factor in this naturally occurring event that's going to crank up temperatures further, we're already starting from a much higher baseline than we've ever had before. And that, frankly, is a problem. Think of it like a compressed spring. Right now, that heat hasn't fully burst through to the surface yet, but once it does, it can rapidly trigger full-blown El Niño conditions. And here's the genuinely unsettling part. This exact same pattern, the weakening trade winds, the Kelvin waves, the subsurface heat buildup, showed up right before both the 1997 and 2015 Super El Niños. Those are the two biggest El Niño events in modern recorded history. So when scientists see this pattern re-emerging, they take it very seriously. So naturally, the big question on everyone's mind is, just how big is this one actually going to be? Well, for starters, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center has placed the odds of El Niño fully emerging by July at 82%, with roughly a 37% chance that it becomes a genuinely very strong El Niño by the winter of 2026. Those are already fairly striking numbers. But the United Kingdom and European forecasting estimates are, how do I put this diplomatically, quite a bit more aggressive. The Met Office here in the United Kingdom is projecting temperature anomalies of 2.0 degrees Celsius by September of 2026. And the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, one of the most respected forecasting bodies in the world, suggests there's a real chance of temperature anomalies exceeding 3 degrees before October, which would push us well and truly into Super El Niño territory. In fact, on the more dramatic end of the spectrum compared to the American forecast, the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts puts the odds of a full-blown Super El Niño by July at already beyond 50%. And as we move deeper into winter, their models suggest its emergence starts to look practically inevitable. Now, just a quick word of caution here, because I know a lot of you are clued up on this already, but it's worth saying anyway. Forecasters themselves acknowledge that these models tend to overshoot El Niño strength when predictions are made in spring. The actual outcome really hinges on whether those westerly winds keep doing what they're currently doing. But because they are, right now, actively blowing in that direction, that's exactly where these bold numbers are coming from. However you choose to interpret all these percentages and projections is entirely up to you, but what does seem certain, what we can say with real confidence, is that the environment right now is primed and ready for a genuinely strong event. So let's say we do end up with this fabled Super El Niño. What would that actually mean for us, day-to-day, weather-wise? The short answer is amplified extremes across the board. Every single one of the usual El Niño effects would essentially get supercharged. Picture it like driving around with your favorite music blasting, except somebody's cranked the bass all the way up to maximum. Same song, same beat, but everything hits so much harder. The first and probably most obvious consequence, something we've already touched on, is a record-breaking global heat spike. Every El Niño year tends to bring hotter conditions worldwide, and even without any additional boost from greenhouse gas emissions, we'd typically expect somewhere in the range of a 0.1 to 0.2 degree temperature increase globally. But for a genuine Super El Niño, that could push global temperatures across 2026 and 2027 to completely unprecedented heights, potentially making them the hottest years ever recorded, exceeding 1.7, maybe even 1.8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And in the most extreme modeled scenarios, sea surface temperature anomalies in the Pacific region could approach a genuinely stark 3.8 degrees Celsius by the end of the year. And when you stop to consider that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been urging the world to limit overall warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius, you really start to grasp just how extreme a scenario like this would be. But temperature alone isn't the only thing we need to worry about here. We'd also be looking at a series of extreme precipitation patterns hitting virtually every corner of the planet. A Super El Niño would likely bring absolutely torrential rains to the coastlines of Peru and Ecuador. But further inland, the situation flips entirely. The Amazon rainforest would face what amounts to a thermal stress test, combining intense drought with record-breaking temperatures simultaneously. Trees across the rainforest would be pushed well beyond their natural tolerance limits. Previous Super El Niño events have actually seen the Amazon flip from being a carbon sink, something that absorbs carbon dioxide, into a carbon source, something that releases it, as drought kills off massive swaths of the forest canopy. In 2026, with the baseline temperature already sitting higher than ever before, the risk of what scientists call megafires breaking out across the so-called lungs of the planet would be at an all-time high. Meanwhile, over in North America, forecasters expect the jet stream to split. That would give the United States Southwest and California a sort of Godzilla winter, complete with heavy snowpack and torrential rains. Now, in the short term, this could actually help relieve strained reservoirs, which honestly sounds like good news. But it also brings the immediate threat of atmospheric rivers. These are long, narrow plumes of concentrated water vapor flowing in from the tropics. These events are capable of triggering catastrophic landslides and causing serious localized flooding. Meanwhile, over on the Pacific Northwest coast, conditions would swing the opposite way entirely, with unusually hot and dry weather settling in. And on the complete other side of the globe, in Australia, the outlook is equally sobering. The Bureau of Meteorology has already issued a below-average rainfall forecast covering the eastern and southwestern parts of the country. And it's not just the lack of rain that's concerning. Farmers in New South Wales are staring down a genuine perfect storm. Many of them are still recovering financially and emotionally from the massive floods of previous years, and now they could be hit by a triad of compounding pressures, intensifying drought being just the first of them. And on top of all that, we've got extreme bushfire risk, plus a global spike in fertilizer and fuel costs, all wrapped up into one giant mess. As we touched on earlier, El Niño does something really strange to the traditional hurricane seasons we're used to. Generally speaking, it tends to tilt the odds toward more Pacific cyclones while reducing the number of Atlantic hurricanes. Take 2015, for example. During the strongest El Niño we had seen up to that point, the Central Pacific had an unusually active cyclone season. In total, there were 16 storms, including 3 simultaneous Category 4 storms happening at the same time. That is genuinely wild when you think about it. So if we do get a Super El Niño in 2026, that would likely mean a quieter Atlantic season, which sounds like good news if you're on the United States East Coast. But it's terrible news for the Eastern Pacific, which affects places like Mexico, Hawaii, and beyond. And yeah, you guessed it, there's more. Historically, El Niño events have caused fish population declines and even penguin die-offs in the Galapagos Islands, all because of changes in ocean currents. A Super El Niño would only crank up these biological stresses even further, putting even more pressure on already fragile ecosystems. And all of that is before we've even gotten to the thing that actually keeps us alive: food. Even right now, climate analysts are already warning that a strong El Niño could put serious strain on food supplies. The India Meteorological Department has projected the 2026 monsoon at just 92% of its long-period average. That would be the lowest figure in nearly 30 years. That's a direct threat to what are called the kharif crops, the staple foods like rice, cotton, and soybeans that literally feed billions of people across the region. If the rains fail during August and September, we're not just talking about dry fields, we're talking about food inflation that could exceed 4.5%, which would seriously destabilize the rural economy for the entire subcontinent. And there's another twist here too. The Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit recently published an article noting that an El Niño-driven weather shock, layered on top of war-related fertilizer and fuel disruptions, could drive up both prices and inflation simultaneously. In short, harvests in key farming regions, rice in Asia, coffee in Africa, maize in Latin America, would suffer significantly, amplifying hunger and economic stress not just locally, but across the entire planet. Analysis from the United Nations World Food Programme warned that the number of food-insecure people across the globe could reach levels last seen at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, potentially impacting up to 318 million people worldwide who are already food insecure. Yeah, it's a lot to take in, isn't it? Sorry for that tirade of information there. But if you're looking for a scrap of good news, well, as good as it can be, come over to Europe. Here where I am in the United Kingdom, and across mainland Europe more broadly, El Niño's influence tends to be much more indirect. Some studies suggest El Niño winters tend to be milder and wetter in Northern Europe, but honestly, the signal here is pretty weak, and the summer impacts are even less predictable than that. If you look back at some of the developing El Niño years, 1997, 2015, even 2023, they all featured at least some hot spells, but there's no simple pattern, nothing that really unifies them in any meaningful way. But of course, thanks to our good old friend global warming, any specific El Niño effect might actually be quite hard to untangle from the ongoing trend of record summer heat we're already seeing across Europe anyway. So either way, we're not exactly off the hook. And all of this stuff we've just talked about doesn't just carry a human cost, there's also a massive financial one attached to it. In 2023, researchers from Dartmouth University estimated that the average El Niño event drains about $3.4 trillion from the global economy. That's because of destroyed crops, disrupted flows of goods and services, and all sorts of other knock-on effects. And remember, that's just the estimate for an average El Niño. A Super El Niño would be far more devastating than that. None of that makes for particularly great reading, does it? There's nothing remotely super about any of this from where we're standing, which does kind of beg the question, why is this happening in the first place? Well, you might assume it's simply because of global warming, which is honestly sort of what I think too. But bear with me here, because even though this might sound like a bit of a cop-out, scientists are genuinely still studying exactly how global warming affects the El Niño Southern Oscillation cycle, and the truth, according to them, isn't clear-cut at all. Look, as I've mentioned throughout this video, El Niño isn't new, and it isn't particularly special in and of itself. It used to be a bit like that one uncle you'd see at family gatherings every couple of years, who'd say something a little odd, and then you wouldn't see him again until the next event. But this time, something is clearly different. The United Nations has warned that Earth's climate system is further out of balance right now than at any other point in recorded history. So how can both of those things be true at once? Based on that logic, good old Uncle El Niño Southern Oscillation would have shown up to the party eventually anyway, right? Well, yes. But here's the thing. Today's oceans are warmer than they've been in decades. The World Meteorological Organization notes that the period from 2015 to 2025 saw ocean temperatures reach the hottest 11-year span on record, with Earth gaining heat faster than ever before measured. More than 90% of the Earth's extra energy ends up heating the oceans, and according to the World Meteorological Organization, the heat stored in the upper 2 kilometers of the global oceans reached a brand new high in 2025. Over the last 2 decades, that heat has been building more than twice as quickly as it did during the late 20th century. Now add into that mix a series of late winter westerly wind bursts that have been pushing heat eastward, pumping up the tropical Pacific's heat content even further, and you've got the stage set for a potentially very strong, or even a full-blown Super El Niño event. If, or really when, that happens, it will escalate into a Super El Niño. The the kind we've only witnessed a handful of times throughout recorded history. And that event would supercharge global warming and extreme weather events right across the planet. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Climate Prediction Center updates its El Niño Southern Oscillation predictions once every month. So by the time you're hearing this, there might already be more up-to-date information available. We could even already be in the midst of a Super El Niño right now. But what we do know for certain is that Super El Niños have happened before, and given everything we've just laid out, they will almost certainly happen again. And whatever ends up happening, one thing's for sure. It's going to be a wild ride watching this particular event play out across the globe.